Hello, Washington Commanders family, and welcome to another edition of the Washington Wrap. I'm your host, Chad Ryan, and I'm flying solo for this Week 1 preview episode, although it's not really a Week 1 preview episode. We'll get into that in a little bit. But if you haven't listened to this show or watched this show before, typically we are a single issue per episode show where we start a 10-minute countdown timer, hence the logo up there if you're watching, and try to wrap it up in 10 minutes. So we'll start the countdown clock in a moment, but just before we start off, I'm just going to preface what this week's episode is all about, and we're going to be looking at the 3 key performance indicators or KPIs that I'll be watching through the first 4 games of the season, of course paying particular emphasis to Game 1 against Jacksonville, to get a sense of where the Commanders are at for 2022, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about those 3 today. So I'm going to start the 10-minute countdown clock. If you're watching the video version of this show, you'll see it below me in a second. If you're listening to the podcast version, you won't obviously hear that, so you'll just have to trust me that I've done this within 10 minutes. So let's start the clock. 10 minutes to wrap it up. And key performance indicator number 1 for me is a simple one, and I've talked about this on a few guest appearances on various shows over the summer, but it's the sacks. Washington has invested heavily in our front 7, and even though Chase Young is beginning the season on the pup, that still leaves guys like Montez Sweat, Deron Payne, Jonathan Allen. These are guys that have been, a premium price has been paid for them. So Washington really needs to improve their sack results, their sack numbers. Last year, they averaged 2.2 sacks per game. That was down from the previous season where we're at 2.9. 2.2 had us in the sort of bottom, the middle to bottom of the NFL. 2.9 had us sort of in the middle to the top. Considering the premium price that we've paid for our front 7, and yes, try saying that 3 times fast, those numbers simply aren't good enough. Now, if you're being generous, that's not necessarily solely on the players in the front 7. Our defensive scheme has allowed too many quick passes, and that's what I'm talking about when I say I want to see our sack numbers go up this season. I want to see more coverage sacks. I want to see wide receivers not open after 1.5 seconds, so a quarterback on a 3 or 5 step quick drop back, has multiple options. I want to see our defense having time to get to the quarterback, which is something that under Jack Del Rio's defensive scheme has sorely been missing in the past 2 seasons, and we didn't see it in the preseason this year either. So I'm really hoping that we see significant and rapid improvement in that regard to open the 2022 campaign, because it's really one of the key, pardon the pun, key performance indicators for determining how successful this defense is going to be this year. If we can't stop quick passes, that's currently what the tape is on the 2021 version of the Washington defense. If that persists into 2022, that's going to be a big concern. And it doesn't play to our guys' strengths, like, guys like Jonathan Allen, Montez Sweat, even Chase Young. These aren't guys that rely on speed to win their battles. There's an element of technique and power there as well, and that takes time to develop. Unless you're completely unblocked or you are able to shed your block instantly, you're going to take about 1 to 1.5 to 2 seconds to get to the quarterback, typically, on a regular sort of drop back. And we just didn't see enough of that. They weren't terrible sack numbers for Washington last year, but compared to the price we paid for our defensive front, not enough, to put it very simply and bluntly. So that's KPI number 1 for me. We need to see a big improvement in the sack numbers. I want to go from 2.2 sacks a game to much, much closer, if not above 3 sacks a game. And that's not an unrealistic ask. And especially when Chase Young returns, which we hope will be sooner rather than later, and he comes back healthy, it opens up a lot of options for this defense. KPI number 2, pardon me, is quite an obvious one. So I'm acknowledging that right at the start, so I don't get a bunch of comments in the video or on the podcast talking about how this is a Captain Obvious statement. But it's limiting the turnovers, right? So Washington averaged 1.4 turnovers per game last year. That's giveaways. That's not takeaways. We were negative in the turnover differential. We gave the ball away more than our defense got takeaways. It's a simple one. And the concern is, and why I'm listing it as a KPI, because Brian Robinson had that unfortunate incident and won't be starting the season at running back for Washington as we were planning heading into the preseason. It's Antonio Gibson again, who I really like. Antonio Gibson has an enormous amount of talent, but last year he was in the top 10 for fumbles lost in the NFL. And unfortunately, he was the highest ranked running back in that. Everyone above him on fumbles lost was a quarterback, which is not unusual. Sack fumbles count as a fumble lost if the defense takes it away. But where the concern, starts is that Carson Wentz was one of the only guys above Antonio Gibson. He was a quarterback who lost the ball a lot when he was sacked. So combined, our starting quarterback and our starting running back were both top 10 in the NFL for fumbles lost last year. We also know Carson Wentz can throw some interceptions. Typically, it's not because he's being... I'm hesitant to say it's not because he's not being careless with the ball. He's a gunslinger in some respects. So some of his interceptions were essentially arm punts, and that's fine. Well, it's not fine, but you guys understand what I mean. But what I'm talking about is the combination of Wentz and Gibson to start the season, at least for those first 4 games most likely, means that we run a very big risk of a negative turnover differential. If we can mitigate that, if we can protect the ball, if our offensive line can protect Wentz a little bit better than he had in Indianapolis last year, and we can have a positive turnover differential, that's a huge indicator for the kind of success that this offense can be built on. We know in the NFL no team is ever perfect. There's going to be turnovers. But if you can mitigate that risk, if you can lower that number, that's what I'm talking about, because that's going to be huge. And then number 3, this one's a little bit more, pardon me, a little bit more specific, but it's passes to the tight ends. So we know from his time both in Philadelphia and to a lesser extent Indianapolis, but that was more so based on the personnel they had, Carson Wentz is a quarterback who likes his tight ends. Logan Thomas, we know that he's excellent, but we've got some interesting tight ends behind Logan Thomas, and not all of them are going to be active on game day this year. But guys like John Bates, Armani Rogers, and Cole Turner have all flashed some signs. And I feel like as the season progresses, one of those 3 guys behind Logan Thomas is going to emerge as having a little bit of a rapport with Carson Wentz. At least I hope so, because as good as Logan Thomas is, we know he's had some health concerns and some... He's not a guy who has, stayed healthy for a full season. I hope he does this year, and I'd be thrilled if he does, because it would sort of make it this whole point unnecessary. But what I'm essentially saying is I'd like to see one of those other tight ends step up and present as a reliable option. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be catching 100 yards and 2 touchdowns a game. It might only be 1 or 2 key plays per game, and that's enough. That's enough. I just need a reliable tight end behind Logan Thomas with Carson Wentz, because if we can have that, it frees up the middle of the field a little bit more, and then you guys like Curtis Samuel, Terry McLaurin, and Jahan Dotson, who we know are going to be taking passes over the middle because that's how the Scott Turner offense works. It provides an element of freedom for this offense to get some space, get some yards, and continue on. So those are my 3 KPIs for success for this season, and I'm going to be really honed in on those for game 1 against Jacksonville. But this season, really, in other guest appearances and other shows and stuff this season, I always say that I'm reluctant to do sort of season-wide, full season win-loss predictions. I like to look at the season in blocks because, a key injury changes the whole season. So making a season prediction is a little bit of a folly in my opinion. But you look at the first 4 games, 2 away and 2 home, and all 4 games are winnable. They're tough, but they're winnable. So obviously we start at home against the Jags, then we go to Ford Field in Detroit for the Lions, then we have the Eagles at home, and then we go to Jerry World for the Cowboys. So 2 NFC East Division games in the first 4, and 4 winnable games. Tough games against the Eagles and the Cowboys, but I consider every NFC East game winnable because this is a division that has historically been a crapshoot of chaos. The Eagles are probably the toughest opponent in those 4 if you base it on current projections for roster strength for the year. But if the Commanders can be 2-2 or better after those 4, playoffs are probably in the picture. They're at least within this team's grasp. So it's something that I'd like to, pay close attention to these KPIs I've discussed today so we can get an indication of whether or not that's a realistic dream or if it's a pipe dream. What about you guys? What do you think? If the Commanders are 2-2 after their first 4 games against these 4 opponents, is that par for the course? Is that not good enough? Is that an overachievement compared to what you guys thought and your expectations were for this season? I'd love to know. Let me know on Twitter at ChadWeekoTWW, or on Facebook at The Washington Wrap, or on Instagram at The Washington Wrap, or in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube. I'd love to know. Pardon me. I guess gun to my head, I think the Commanders should be 2-2 after the first 4 games. I don't know which of those 4 games they're most likely to win. You'd hope that they'd win against the NFC East if they had to pick any 2 of those games. But I think more likely, given this, what we've seen from this team in recent years, they'll lose a game that we all thought they'd win, but then they'll win a game that we all thought they'd lose. So, maybe we beat Philly and lose to Jacksonville and beat Detroit and lose to Dallas or something like that. So that's my prediction. There's 10 seconds left, or just over 10 seconds left, so I'm going to wrap it up there. We've done it. We've covered the 3 KPIs in 10 minutes. Thank you so much for watching or listening, however you've engaged with this. And if you follow me on Twitter, you would have seen a comment I made a few days ago where I requested, I felt very corny doing this. I very rarely do this. But I'm getting pretty close to 10,000 followers on Twitter, and I would like to hit that milestone this season. And the best way I can achieve that is by you guys helping me out. So please retweet my tweets, share them, comment on them, quote tweet them, especially on game day. On game day, I typically put up GIFs or videos of, plays and highlights and analysis with my own commentary sort of on them. So I really appreciate you guys retweeting those. Retweet the crap out of those, because those are always a good resource for picking up new followers. Thank you so much for watching or listening, Commanders fans. My name has been Chad Ryan. This is the Washington Wrap. We have wrapped it up in 10 minutes. We'll be back next week, probably not alone. So if you got sick of listening to my voice, I apologize, but you did well to hang out there until the end like you have. I'm going to wrap it up there. See you next time. Thank you again.